Hello and welcome back to the channel. Today I'm taking you on a discovery walk through Valletta, the city that the Knights of St. John Hospitaller built on a barren peninsula after fighting off a siege by some 50,000 of Suleiman the Magnificent's finest. The city was established in 1565 and is still going strong, although it has had numerous ups and downs over the years. So strap on your walking shoes and let's take a look at some more of the city, starting where we left off last time, with the fort which saved the knights, Fort St. Elmo, today on The Armchair Traveler. My name is Judy, and I love travel, history, and finding out what makes people tick. If you're enjoying my content, please take a moment to like, share, and subscribe. Your help means more people will see my content. If you want more information, I have a WordPress blog, a page on Facebook, and a Twitter handle. The addresses are here or in the information block at the bottom of the screen. Thank you and enjoy your visit. Last time we broke off our walk just before approaching Fort St. Elmo, an imposing structure on the peninsula's shoreline and prime fodder for tourist cameras, especially those of us arriving by ship. I have to admit it takes some real dedication to history to venture into the heart of the fort, which was every bit as hot and forbidding as it must have been to the knights who built and defended it, and who died to the last man in the process back in 1565. The fort commands two harbors, Marsamxett and the Grand Harbor. Every conqueror or would-be conqueror of the area, going back to the Phoenicians and dating all the way to today, believes that this large protected harbor is a prize worth having. St. Elmo has evolved over time. In 1283, the Aragonese conquered the island and built a watchtower on this spot, which they called St. Elmo. The name stuck. The Knights of St. John arrived in 1530 and reinforced the tower soon after they arrived, but in 1551 an Ottoman raid occurred, prompting the Knights to demolish that tower and build a fort, which you can clearly see in this diagram. The Knights were still working on this establishment in the months before Suleiman's finest arrived in the summer of 1565. The siege had been organized by Mustafa Pasha, who was responsible for the ground armies, and Piali Pasha, the admiral in charge of the fleet, who transported them all the way from Constantinople. The Sultan had counseled these two men to cooperate and promised to send an admiral of the fleet named Dragut, a very famous corsair, to help them. However, the two men squabbled a great deal. Piali Pasha was the Sultan's son-in-law, so he won. Piali wanted Marsamxett Harbor to protect the Sultan's fleet. Piali thought that the original anchorage that he had picked wasn't safe. Eventually, a greater leader named Dragut arrived. Dragut was an immensely talented naval commander and one who had successfully raided here before. He knew the island like the back of his hand, and he told the two squabbling lesser commanders that they should have attacked Medina first. But they did not take his advice. The siege was on. Eventually, Dragut realized that the fort was only holding out because the knights were capable of reinforcing it by bringing over fresh men and supplies every night across the harbor from Fort St. Angelo. Dragut ordered a complete siege of St. Elmo with the aim of isolating it. On June 18th, Dragut took a stone splinter to the head after he was hit by a piece of rock when a cannonball exploded close to his position. He died 5 days later. We know as his death allowed the squabbling between the two senior Ottoman military commanders to resume, and that in turn led to a series of disastrous decisions that probably helped save the knights. Mustafa Pasha, the senior of them and the man in charge of ground forces, eventually did conquer the fortress. He looked across the harbor from the remains of St. Elmo, saw the still formidable Fort St. Angelo in the distance, and said, "Great Allah, if so small a son has cost me so dear, what price shall we have to pay for so large a father?" Today, Fort St. Elmo is a national monument, location of endless picnics and every bit as devoid of shade as it was in the summer of 1565. The fortress was completely destroyed during that siege. After the first siege, Grand Master Jean Perisseau de la Valletta decided to build his new city on the peninsula, and he and his engineers incorporated an enlarged Fort St. Elmo into the design. Malta is basically a rock with very thin soil and limited agricultural capability. Much of their food was imported, and almost all of the wood, even during the days of the knights. The knights built huge underground silos cut into that rock. They understood that sooner or later Suleiman, justifiably annoyed by the knights' continued raids on his shipping, would come gunning for them, and planned to have enough grain stored away so that no matter what else happened, at least they wouldn't starve. When you walk around the fort, you'll see these odd caps in the stone pavement, which are actually pretty easy to trip over. Each covers a bell-shaped reservoir that could be sealed up with mortar to ensure a dry environment that wouldn't let the wheat spoil. During World War II, the British actually added to this fortification by erecting several anti-aircraft batteries on the island. They remain and are still visible. The heat and the sun are still an issue. Present-day Malti take advantage of this situation and have a varying number of itinerant ice cream trucks roving around the boundary of the fortress, as well as a more or less official bar-restaurant dispensing cold beer. I ordered a Corona because this was my first day in Malta and I had actually heard of it. However, Malta does produce lagers, pilsners, and traditional ales. And since my last visit has developed a real local craft beer industry, next time I'll try one of theirs and report back. Once the Grand Master decided to build here on the Scriberis Peninsula, he needed a suitable palace, and this was one of the very first buildings placed here. Most of the knights' buildings across the harbor in Sangli and Burgu were either badly damaged or destroyed, and the knights needed a place for him to live and to do business and greet the international visitors who were flocking to the island. Over time, the palace was enlarged and rebuilt. During the British period, it was still in use as the governor's palace, and it became the Parliament House in 1921. By the 1980s, it was considered outmoded and far too small for that purpose, which eventually led to building a new Parliament House close to the city gates. You can learn more about that by watching part 1 of the Valletta Revisited vlog. The link is in the description box below. The Grand Master's palace was designed by Hieronymus Caesar, a member of the order and a military architect. Note how austere and relatively undecorated it is. Those are hallmarks of the Mannerist style, which he favored. Caesar designed a number of other buildings here in the city and was responsible for the exterior and the original interior of St. John's Co-Cathedral. It might have been a coincidence, and perhaps Caesar simply enjoyed the plain and austere Mannerist style, but like the Co-Cathedral, the building looks to me like it could have originally been designed to be fortified if they ever had to. Note, however, that it's not completely lacking in detail. If you look at the detailed photograph of the entryway, you can see the decoration. Those are 8-pointed stars of the Order of St. John, alternating with the crescent of the Ottomans. Although austere, the palace was not originally without decoration, and it looked quite different at first. The exterior was painted bright red, a color used by the order to mark out public buildings and shown in this picture postcard. After the successful defense of Malta, the princes of Europe, who had been so slow to send men, material, and even money before the siege began, started to realize just how helpful having a competent naval force in this part of the Mediterranean might be to their survival from the continuing threat brought by the Ottoman Turks. European forces had managed to stave off Suleiman at the gates of Vienna in 1529. And the knights turned him away from Malta in 1565, but Suleiman was by no means finished. He was personally leading a siege of a fortress in Hungary in 1566 when he died. Money literally poured into the knights' coffers. The Co-Cathedral, the individual auberges or hostels belonging to the langs of the knights, and this palace reflect that fact. The exterior of the palace might have been plain, but the interior was anything but. Shown here are the ceiling frescoes and a small section of marble inlaid floor in one of the palace corridors. The photograph on the bottom right comes from what is generally called the throne room. The frescoes show us scenes from the Great Siege of 1565, along with portraits of all the presidents of the Republic of Malta. The wallpaper underneath is made of silk. The story goes that ghosts haunt these rooms. I wouldn't be a bit surprised. As remains true today, 16th century Valletta was overwhelmingly hot from late spring until late autumn. What better, more appropriate addition to the palace could there be than a couple of central courtyards, green and shady? The courtyards were practical. They provided for light, ventilation, and circulation of people inside the palace. The clock tower you see here faces Prince Alfred's courtyard. named after Prince Alfred, Duke of Edinburgh, one of Queen Victoria's children. Edward had a naval career and apparently spent at least some time here in Malta. The second courtyard features a statue of Neptune, king of the sea, complete with the coat of arms of Grand Master Pirolo. The Grand Master proposed building square-rigged galleons, although these weren't nearly as maneuverable as the galleys which had dominated until after the Battle of Lepanto. These square-rigged galleons could carry and deploy cannons. With cannons firing broadsides, they could do a much better job of fighting off and even capturing Ottoman galleys. These courtyards both come complete with citrus trees and flowers. I took my photos on March 31st when their geraniums were in full bloom, long before I could even think about planting them at home. The highlight of the palace tour for many people is probably this excellently designed museum. There's a lot for the curious to see and a great deal to learn for anyone who wants to know what a combat infantryman might have endured then and even today. Among these exhibits is a weapons room, shown here with a panoply of cannons, cannonballs, and spears. Along with the weapons, there are collections of knights' armor. This set stands on a platform. The owner was at least 4 inches shorter than I am, or no more than 5'6", and possibly a little less. Armor came in various designs and styles, some highly decorated, although the more lavishly decorated pieces were mostly for show. What you see here is the armor of Grand Master de la Valletta, with separate breast and back plates. It's decorated with engravings on the front, but not inlaid in gold. The armor is probably Italian and was made shortly before the siege. Plate armor worked quite well when your opponent came after you with a sword or a pike, but it was also heavy and quite restrictive. There are stories about knights from the siege of St. Elmo who wore their armor day and night, and who, when wounded and readying themselves for a last stand, had to actually be carried to their posts. Chainmail dates back to at least the 4th century BCE. It is flexible, but distributes weight very unevenly, putting most of the strain on the men's shoulders, which is a real problem since they use their shoulders to bear the weight of their shields and any other weapons. They solved this partly by belting it, but that made it even more uncomfortable. Chainmail required substantial padding underneath and would have been incredibly hot in a Maltese summer. It was also vulnerable to thrusting attacks. Pointed weapons like spears or arrows could force the individual rings apart and pierce it. The knights eventually decided to combine all three, starting with heavy padding, then chainmail, and then plate armor. A full set of chainmail probably weighed a little more than 40 pounds, not counting the padding. Plate armor added at least another 45 pounds or so. The knights would have also carried a shield and a sword or some other weapon. The knights at the time had better nutrition than the average Maltese, so they were probably a bit taller and heavier than the average peasant, clocking in at around 5'7" to 5'9" and probably weighing about 140 pounds. They were carrying more than half their body weight just in their armor. For comparison, the average modern U.S. Marine Corps infantryman weighs in at about 170 pounds. The current recommendation is that a Marine Corps infantryman carry no more than 55 pounds, or about a third of his body weight, for any sustained period of time. The knights, in unbelievable heat, were toting at least 80, probably more, just for the chainmail and armor, plus the sword, shield, and any other weapons. Then, as now, all of these men must be incredibly tough. Just across the street from the Grand Master's Palace, you'll find the modern-day Court of Justice. This first photo shows us what the Auberge d'Auvergne looked like around 1900, quite similar to the way it looked when it was first built. Construction began here almost as soon as the city was established. The building, like so many others, was designed by Hieronymus Caesar, and his undecorated Mannerist style shows. The knights finally left Malta in 1798 when the island fell to Napoleon. The French repurposed the building into a courthouse. The building continued in use as a courthouse until World War II. In 1941, the building was hit by what's called a parachute mine during an air raid, which severely damaged it. The court found temporary quarters elsewhere, but returned to the damaged building 2 years later and continued operating there. Eventually, the building had to be demolished. There was too much damage to repair it after the airstrikes. Today's courthouse is in neoclassical style, but when you take a good look at it, it does show considerable similarities to the original. The main additional feature is an imposing porch with 6 columns, which doesn't go at all well with the original idea. The Maltese really had no choice. The new building has additional features. It now has 7 floors, 3 of which are tucked below ground level so you can't see them. The current building, which you see here, was completed in 1971. Malta is far more than just a city of monuments, walls, gates, churches, parks, and views. People live here. There is a lively music and art scene which the city fathers actively promote. One of those promotions turned out to be a series of statues meant to illustrate and explain various sayings in Maltese. This one was labeled in one ear and out the other. The translation of that Maltese phrase shows us that people everywhere have similar comments to make. There were quite a few of these installations, but as far as I can tell, they've all been removed. In the background is a more permanent statue of Queen Victoria. Somehow, I don't think Her Majesty was amused. This is Castile Square, home of the Prime Minister's palace. The official name of the palace is actually the Auberge de Castile, and it was the home of the Knight of the Lang of Castile. The original building was designed by Girolamo Cassar, most likely in the rather plain Mannerist style you see all over Valletta, but the building was updated and refurbished 2 centuries later under a Portuguese Grand Master who favored the Baroque style, which he apparently introduced to the island. Today's building looks far more decorative than, for example, the remains of the original fortifications, now called the Creative Space. That area was repurposed from the St. James Calaver, but still retains its original exterior architectural design. This entire area was an important part of the city fortifications, and the palace gives nod to that fact with 2 enormous decorative cannons, one on either side of the front door. There are monuments and statues galore in the area. But the one that looked so out of place my tourist camera literally begged me to check it out was this one. The knot commemorates the African-European Migration Summit in 2015. Malta sits halfway between Africa and Europe and is in a very difficult position on the subject of welcoming immigrants, even those just passing through. Malta has a long history of immigration and immigration and is in the middle of a migrant flow. Requests for asylum have surged. It's difficult to get accurate numbers, but it appears that the number of migrants arriving by sea has actually gone down in the past 5 years. Malta and Italy have consistently argued that they bear an unfair burden of Europe-bound sea migration. 4,000 delegates showed up for this meeting, and they agreed on some groundwork for improved cooperation and initiatives. Unfortunately, most of the world wasn't ready to address the elephant in the room. Why were and are so many people willing to risk the dangers in migrating north, whether legally or illegally? Until that question is answered, I don't think we'll see much progress in curing illegal migration. This is Our Lady of Victory Church, formerly known as St. Anthony the Abbot Church. It was the first building and the first church completed in Valletta after the Great Siege. Grand Master Jean Perisseau de la Vallette and his order actually built it as a kind of thanksgiving. The Grand Master personally financed the construction costs, and when he died, he was interred here first, although his remains were later moved to the grander co-cathedral. I wasn't able to find a painting of it as it was originally designed, but my guess would be knowing that it was most likely designed by Girolamo Cassar, the military architect who so favored the Mannerist style and whom we have met before. The facade would have been quite plain and functional, and possibly designed to be fortified should the need arise in the future. The interior would have been simple as well. Styles change over time. This painting by a Russian artist named Nikolai Krasnov shows us what it might have looked like in the early 1900s after refurbishments. In the 18th century, the facade was rebuilt to add a Baroque facing and a bell tower, along with a parish priest's house, possibly the reddish building you see on the right of this painting. In 1716, a Maltese artist named Alessio Rardi painted the vault with scenes of the life of the Virgin Mary. After the knights were forced off the island by the French, who in turn were driven out by the British, the church became the garrison church of the Royal Fencible Regiment, later called the Royal Malta Artillery. During World War II, the building was badly damaged in the same raid that destroyed the Royal Opera House. Initial repairs were made to stabilize the structure and address the worst of the damage, but it took a long time to finish the rehabilitation. In 2000, a much larger restoration project began, focusing on the facade, the finials, the roof, and part of the belfry. Efforts to restore the interior, including the ceiling paintings, were not begun until 2004 and were finally finished in 2016. Valletta has always been a port and services private, commercial, and military visitors. Straight Street is every bit as unique as the rest of the city itself. Originally known as the Gut, it was the center for entertainment, nightlife, and scandal. I think the syncopated rag you're listening to in the background, called the Maltese Cross Rag by Wilffred G. Astle, and dating from 1905, perfectly shows what the street must have been like in its heyday. Soldiers, sailors, locals, many other visitors converged here looking for relief, beer, amusement, and companionship. The atmosphere was a lively one, if a little unsavory. This was Valletta's most famous red light district. After the British left Malta in the 1970s, Straight Street, like much of the rest of the city, began to decline and fade. There were families who lived in this area who decided they were going to pull it up by its own bootstraps, and the area has been regenerated. Today it's still known for its restaurants, bars, and cabarets, but the red light, and generally off-putting, at least to me, reputation, lives on only in memory. Since we've walked and talked, it's time for us to take a break. I deliberately chose the gaudiest, brightest, most interesting-looking restaurant that had outdoor seating that was available. It's called Tico Tico. The inside is decorated with pin-ups and gaudy red velvet armchairs and the kind of things that you would associate it with an old-fashioned bar. There was no point, as it turned out, in sitting inside. The open doors clearly signaled that there was no air conditioning, and I could hear the music coming out. Dinner was excellent. The first course was an antipasto plate with olives, cucumbers, and more, the sort of thing you find all over Sicily, along with some fairly coarse red wine whose origin eluded me. Malta does produce red wine, and some of them are said to be pretty good, but mine must have come out of a barrel, so I didn't bother to note the origin. Next came a seafood stew, heavy with the garlic and shellfish. The main course was fried rabbit, salad, and french fries. Everything was excellent, the people were friendly, the staff was efficient, the food tasted great. The music, leaking out or flooding out from the interior, was actually not too loud. I was horrified when I was finishing up this vlog to learn that in 2023 the restaurant had been closed down, but was quite happy to find out that was just for it to refurbish. It has reopened, there's a new chef and a new menu, supposedly more trendy, but the rabbit is still there. Game on, as far as I'm concerned. Thank you for joining me for this walk through Valletta, the city of the Knights. Come back next time for another adventure with me, the Armchair Traveler.